Luigi, maybe we got to move all manufacturing back to Italy. Let's go buy one of those little, they're selling those houses for $1 over there. Let's just make it manufacturing. We'll import everything from Italy again. What do you think?
But that's the global landscape. Everything comes full circle. There's this little town outside of Florence called Prato, and allegedly like 90% of the population is Chinese.
Yeah.
So, go figure. It's still made in Italy. It's just not made by Italians.
Let's go!
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Liquid Lunch Project. I am Matthew R. Meehan alongside my partner, the professor, Luigi Rosabianca. What's on tap today, Lou?
Matt, today we have a repeat guest. We have the illustrious Eric Youngstrom, who is the CEO of OnRamp. OnRamp is the premier e-commerce lender. Now, we asked Eric to be on today to give us a general state of the union of the e-commerce space. So, Eric, welcome back to the podcast, buddy.
Thanks for having me again, guys. I appreciate it.
So there's been a lot of stuff since last you were on. It's been about a year now. You were episode 162. And DT47 is back. Trump is talking about all these tariffs, and there's a lot of unique things going on in the e-commerce space. Kind of give us a sense of what you're seeing.
Yeah, no, it's certainly been exciting. I'm not sure that's the right word. Yeah, we're, from a macro perspective, Trump is kind of rebuilding the economic world order right now, right? Away from what was Bretton Woods post World War II to a new system, right? That's, no longer about trying to defeat communism, but that's about, kind of setting a level trade playing field for the United States. That's not going to come without pain. And that pain is certainly out there right now. But, I'm certainly hopeful that it starts to do more to kind of bring some manufacturing and other economic activity back into the United States, really do a job of bringing more jobs here. From an e-commerce perspective, though, those tariffs are hurting, right? Like our merchants and our business partners who are selling online with Chinese supply chain are, for a couple of weeks there, right, 150% tariff levels. Those have stabilized now at 50. Everybody wants them to go away, but we'll have to wait and see kind of what the final end state of it all is. But for now, right, like I think, we saw a lot of pull forward at the beginning of the year, January, February, before the tariffs were imposed, people trying to get inventory in stock before those tariff prices were going to start driving their cost up. March, April were pretty slow months, right? Because people were kind of trying to wait and see what was going to happen. We saw a lot of reduced kind of purchase orders, if you will, right? People, instead of buying 3 months of inventory, would buy 1 month, hoping that then when they came back next month, the tariff price would be lower so that they weren't overpaying on tariffs while they're getting stuff in. I won't say who. There's the guys selling exotic sports cars out of Europe. Some of those guys pre-sell the car before the car gets shipped. And there was some turmoil around that, right? Because all of a sudden, a very expensive car had a markup price that didn't even cover the new tariff impact on that wholesale cost. So I know that there's been a lot of scrambling around this. Hopefully the dust settles here soon, and we actually can kind of get to a better place where it's easier to plan and really just build for the future without a lot of the chaotic noise that's been going on.
So I know what a lot of the larger e-com companies have been doing is they've been getting bonded warehouse space in Mexico. You can't find bonded warehouse space in Mexico. So they're purchasing everything and they're letting it sit in Mexico until we get some clarity on what's going on with the situation. Right. So there's a lot of products sitting in Mexico right now.
Yeah. The challenge at that though, right, is, China had played that game before, right? Basically rerouting product into Vietnam and then shipping it as a Vietnamese product that wouldn't have the same tariff. Mm-hmm. But the Trump guys are wise to that, and they're actually going back to these different countries and saying, no, you cannot just be a pass through for Chinese goods, right? You're going to impose that tariff on Chinese goods, or we're just going to put that tariff on Mexico, right? And then on the Mexican side, right, there's an even bigger problem with Mexican government's very concerned about taxes on remittances from, Mexican nationals in the U.S., which would, it wouldn't be a tariff on the product, right, but it would be a massive impact to, the Mexican GDP when, those remittances are just so damn important to Mexico. Yep. So I think it's an interesting and probably a smart strategy to play out. But I don't know it's as easy as just simply saying, hey, now it's a Mexican product.
No, they're not saying it's a Mexican product. They're just not bringing it into the U.S. until there's clarity on the situation, right? Because you don't have to pay the tariff until it crosses the border into the U.S., right? So what I'm saying here is there's a lot of companies that bought a lot of Chinese product. They're not saying it's Mexican. They're just in a holding pattern because it's being held in Mexico until we realize it. So it's not 150% this week. Oh, it's only 50. We're going to cross it over the border.
Right. Yeah. And then, hey, and great. Now I got to buy my bulk inventory, right, at my bulk discount. Mm-hmm. It's not in the U.S. And, if a month from now that Chinese tariff drops to 20%, well, great. Then I can start moving. Exactly. I'll move the next month's worth of inventory over, right? Which is a smart thing to do. But yeah, for those that were actually just trying to then reclassify it as a Mexican product under a Mexican tariff regime, I don't think, well, I think that will work from time to time, but I think as a strategy, that's not going to be very long lived.
Yeah, I don't see that working. The Trump team is onto that right away. They know exactly what they're doing. You're not pulling the wool over their eyes. So do you think? So what about shipping costs right now? Because there's a lot going on with shipping with the wars too. So e-commerce, they're getting hit from every angle possible if they're importing.
The shipping cost thing is interesting, right? Trump. Early in when he jammed that 150% tariff on China, right? The other thing they did was started talking about a docking fee for non-U.S. container ships. Now, I think they backed off of that pretty quick because one, there's a implementation cost. How do you even do it? Like, who collects the fee? How does that get back to the Treasury, right? So it's not as simple as just saying, give me money. Two, there's not a lot of U.S. flagged container ships out there, right? So you actually have just an infrastructure question of how are you going to reflag those container ships so that they wouldn't have that problem. So the last I checked on that, they kind of backed off on that. By the way, I'm not an expert on this, so if I'm getting this wrong, apologies. Then you have what during COVID, and I think it was coincidental it happened during COVID, but there was a big push from the green movement, right, that we've actually slowed down the pace of these container ships because it uses less fuel, causes less greenhouse gases to be emitted. There was some kind of unintended consequence. That somebody was suspected that in fact all that greenhouse gas emission from these container ships was actually keeping things cooler, right? And that some of the warming over the last 3 years might have been, in fact, we just didn't have as many emissions coming from container ships. In COVID, the price of those, to get a container spiked. So that came back down. Honestly, I think, kind of any shipping changes right now probably get washed out just because your kind of 4-year average price has been coming down so quickly because of what happened in that initial spike, 2020, 2021, with a huge spike in e-commerce demand because you couldn't go to a grocery store, you couldn't go to any stores, right? And so we were shifting supply chains around all of that. What that means on a day-to-day basis, I'm probably not as close to that, but it clearly has a big impact on your margin, right? Like the cost of shipping is a big piece of that. The good news for e-commerce is I want to say it's either 60 or 70% of the cost of moving goods is actually the last mile. It's from your warehouse to that customer, right? And last mile isn't the right word, last leg, right? Because now you're only shipping one product at a time. Whereas you've got a container full of, 100,000 units and maybe that costs you $20K, but that's 20 cents a unit, right? Versus to ship a single unit from Austin to New York, that's $10, right? And so, it's that last leg of the journey that really drives the cost of the e-commerce sale from a shipping perspective.
So Eric, we see the frustrations on the supply chains for an e-commerce company. How do you deal with it as a lender when you're underwriting those files, when you obviously have those delays? with supply chains, and maybe you have some frustrations in receivables?
I mean,
Sorry, guys.
one, because of the short-term nature of our product, right? We're really we're optimized, right, for really two key components of an e-commerce business, which is you've got your supply chain timeline, and then you got your inventory turnover timeline, right? Inventory turnover happens after the supply chain order. That maybe it takes 2 weeks to get to your warehouse or 8 weeks to get to your warehouse. Then you break that down into component units of inventory to go sell. And then how long does it take you to turn that inventory over? Inventory turnover times in e-commerce average kind of 50 to 60 days. Supply chain timeline is really dictated by where your supply chain is, right? If you're US based, you've got a freight timing, right? Assuming the inventory is in stock at the supplier, it's really just how long does it take to put that thing into onto a railroad or onto a truck and get it across the country to your warehouse. Typically a week or two, right? If you're buying from China, you might have 4 to 12 weeks, right? And so we really optimize across those two components. And so that's really then done on an individual merchant basis. And we do that based on the data that we can see in terms of what their sales velocity is, demand forecasting, demand planning, and then really just kind of paying attention to those supply chain timelines. From a lending perspective, what we've seen really is the kind of average duration going up 2 to 4 weeks. And that's really kind of addressing that, just because, slowdowns and things like that are having that impact there. But really, the demand is still there, right? And so the bigger question for us is going to be, is those tariff prices, as merchants have to address that. If you increase the price of product, right, your demand will fall, right? There's the price elasticity question.
Let's talk about that for a second, because Amazon did something right away, and then they stopped it, where they put the tariff increase in the price on the website. What's your take on that?
I think it was an interesting play. It forces the consumer to look at that. But I also think, if I recall, I think it backfired on them, right? That it was like, hold on.
Yeah, I think Trump made a phone call, and next thing you know, Bezos took it down.
Right. Well, and then there's another thing, right? Which is, Amazon's famous for saying, your margin is my opportunity, right? But there's also, there's a lot of unhappy small businesses, right, where their product, they manufactured it in China. It's the classic story, right? Like the Chinese warehouse is running during the day, making the product for me, and at night they're making the exact same product, and they're coming to Amazon, setting up a shop and selling it without having to go, without my markup in it, right? And so I think the confluence of events there kind of backfired on what Amazon was trying to do. I'm not opposed to people seeing the economic cost of these things. I think it's actually, I studied economics in college. I think it's actually an interesting lesson, right? But I don't think it worked out the way Amazon wanted it to, which is why they backed off of it.
So let's say we stabilize around 50%, right? What's an e-commerce business owner's next move? Do we raise prices immediately? Do we take it on the chin for a little while? Do we gradually increase prices? What are your thoughts?
I think the answer to that is twofold. One, you've got to diversify your supply chain, right? There are other countries that manufacture that are going to be running at 10, 20% tariffs, where, Apple famously moved 3 million iPhones from China to India right before the Chinese tariff went into effect. Yes, there was a phone call somewhere behind the scenes. And I would have actually liked to seen that call from Tim Cook to China saying, hey, you've got 5 days. You got to get those 3 million phones out of there now. And I can't imagine that wasn't just 24/7 around the clock trying to get that done. But you have to diversify that supply chain, right? You need to go look at Mexico. You need to go look at, depending what your product is, right? Can you go to Vietnam? Can you go to Mexico? Can you go to the U.S.? The interesting thing about the U.S., right, is we used to be a textile country. That those jobs left, and I don't know that those jobs need to come back. But there are some great examples, in North Carolina, of these giant textile manufacturers running, like a facility that sits on like 10 acres. And effectively, it takes a couple of people to go load raw cotton and whatever other, polyester or what have you into one end of the machine. And it takes a software engineer then. And at the other end, you're just spitting out bolts and bolts of fabric, right?
Wow.
And you can even then have that done where it's already pre-cut to the t-shirt. And it takes a little while for those things to come online, but when they do, when it's that automated, all of a sudden your U.S. supplier then is actually a cost-effective alternative to what was China or Bangladesh, right? With hundreds of women running, or men and women running sewing machines, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden that becomes something viable here, but there has to be that economic impetus to kick that off. So I think the most important thing for the e-commerce business owner is really go look at your supply chain. And there are great companies like there's we're partners with a group called Gemba here in Austin that actually does full product development, but not just creating the product and finding the manufacturer. They build the supply chain for you, right? And so those guys are a great place to go, a great resource to be able to say, hey, great, I've got this product, here are the full specs, it's being manufactured in China. Where can I go in the world to then get away from those tariffs? Maybe I can move that from China to Mexico or Colombia, right? Where I'm going to reduce my shipping costs because I don't have nearly the transit distance, right? And I'm going to avoid these tariffs and actually keep being able to run my business where I'm not talking about changing the price to the customer anymore, right? That I'm just actually building a more resilient, diversified supply chain so that I've got flexibility if we're going to have this economic impact again.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think we are going to have manufacturing back here, but it's not going to be the way we know manufacturing right now. Or
No.
we think of sweatshops in China. It's going to be fully automated and robotic, which will drive the
Yep.
cost down, right? Again, but
Correct.
it's going to take time to do that. And I think part of Trump's whole plan is, I don't know how familiar you guys are with the big, beautiful bill, but setting up they're going to give you 100% tax, allegedly 100% tax credit for building out a manufacturing facility.
Right, which then all of a sudden makes
huge
a
sense.
U.S. supplier
Mm-hmm.
able to bring a product to market that is economically competitive. And the beauty of that then as the e-commerce seller is, one, I'm buying from the U.S. Now, again, raw materials may be coming from elsewhere that may have some tariff impacts, but then that tariff impact is going to be far less on my business than me having 100% of that done in China.
Yeah.
I'm going to have a shorter supply chain window, right? So now I don't need 8 weeks, I need 2 weeks, right? My just-in-time inventory is going to be faster, so I can then better optimize, financing costs and everything else around my business, and they can be far more nimble around, changing to, demand. So as if I see a spike in demand on, my collared polo, I can go get a bunch more of those made right away and always keep them in stock versus, oh crap, I'm out of stock now. It's going to be 12 weeks before I've got them back in stock and can keep selling them.
Yeah. Luigi, maybe we got to move all manufacturing back to Italy. Let's go buy one of those little, they're selling those houses for $1 over there. Let's just make it manufacturing. We'll import everything from Italy again. What do you think?
But that's the global landscape. Everything comes full circle. There's this little town outside of Florence called Prato, and allegedly like 90% of the population is Chinese.
Yeah.
So, go figure. It's still made in Italy. It's just not made by Italians.
What didn't the Louis Vuitton guys get in trouble because they were saying made in Italy, but it was like 99% made in China? Then it was
that's where the legalities come into play, right? It's like where does the product take its final form? I mean, what kind of cockamamie nonsense is that? Okay, so you strap on the handle to the briefcase.
Yep.
So I was in Thailand last summer with my family. We're in Bangkok. I loved it. We had a great time. But they have these malls. And when I say malls, I'm not talking about 1 or 2 story malls like we have here. We're talking about 7 and 8 floors of bootleg products.
Right.
It's all counterfeit coming, and they're being sold right in the open. But here's the best part. You walk in, you know everything's bootleg when you're walking around, you're looking. But then they say, hey, I got the good stuff. Then they open the back door and there's another warehouse full of the good stuff, the good bootlegs. You know what's happening there. It's being made in China. It's probably Louis Vuitton's probably making it there. And part of it's going out door A and the other part's going out door B. It might actually be the same stuff at the end
No,
of the day.
that's exactly it, right? And so which again, the reason for the Trump tariffs, right, is to go address those kind of unfair trade practices and how much intellectual property has been stolen, not just from America, but from every country in the world that's gone to China and say, hey, set up my shop, right? And, I mean, if you're going to run a business in China, it has to be 51% owned by a Chinese entity. Well, hold on, right? Like that, we don't enforce that here. And so I'm actually all for these reciprocal tariff ideas. I think that you need to put a level playing field in place and you need to actually hold all of your trading partners to a common set of rules and expectations. And if they're not going to, if they're not going to honor those things, then there does need to be something done in the market that says, hey, look, this is actually destroying the American or hurting the American economy. It's removing American jobs. And to your point, right, if we're going to rebuild manufacturing here in the U.S., it's not going to be the same jobs. We're not talking about bringing back seamstresses, right? Now it's going to be, hey, you have to be an electrical engineer to go repair this automated facility, right? And you have to be a software programmer. And so we're going to create different jobs, but that are going to support that manufacturing base that then actually has a far broader positive economic impact on the U.S.
Eric, it's interesting the way you started today's podcast is you started the conversation with the macroeconomic climate changing, and it's possible that we need a whole bunch of new acronyms, the WHO,
right,
the NAFTA. I mean, these organizations are ineffective. I mean, when one can argue if they were ever effective, but today they are ineffective. But given that global landscape and the unique nature of OnRamp and your underwriting, is there a scenario where OnRamp can fund international e-commerce companies one day?
One day, yeah. We don't do it today, right? We're still making sure we've got the U.S. market dialed in. The challenge with funding in other countries is it's not just the business and OnRamp. We have to have the banking relationships. There are going to be different regulatory regimes that you have to adhere to and make sure you're compliant with. You're going to have different credit policies and things like that. That it may not. The on-ramp credit policy may not change, but because the French have a different set of rules, right? Actually, our CFO used to work for a global company, and he set up their financing arm, and he set up banks in 7 different countries around the world. They were trying to set one up in Brazil, and the challenge in Brazil was like their banking laws were so different. And if I remember correctly, in Brazil, you can't charge interest on weekends and holidays. You can only charge interest on business days. And so they actually walked away. Like, look, we have
That's
a partner
so
who does this.
Brazilian.
We're going to keep this partner, right? And so, it's going to depend on the market, right? Because each market has their own set of rules, and some of those it may not be cost effective for us to operate in.
But how could you charge interest if you're playing football on a Saturday and you're going to the beach on a Sunday? Come on.
Exactly. That doesn't seem fair.
So wasn't there something like you can get in a cab in Brazil and it can start out at $100, and by the time you get to your destination, it's $800 because there's so much, everything that goes on with the currency there. The inflation is insane.
Right. Yeah. I don't know anything about Brazilian inflation, but certainly when inflation is happening, right, that kind of stuff can happen.
It was so bad a few years ago. My neighbors,
Yeah.
a lot of my neighbors are actually Brazilian. They were telling me that.
Okay.
Yeah. So they were everything was going into US dollars because you couldn't hold anything. It just didn't make sense.
So you mentioned on a prior visit to us, Eric, that the e-commerce space, even though it's 15 to 20 years old, right? The initial e-commerce businesses started then. The proverbial picks and shovels of the industry have not been fully built out yet.
Correct.
What is missing in the e-commerce space? Like if you had the power to wave that magic on-ramp wand, what picks and shovels would you include onto this this space?
Gosh, man, if I knew that, I'd just go start that new business and be a billionaire like Tobias over at Shopify next month. Um, I mean, look, part of the problem, right, is that it's just it's a new industry, right, and it's not just e-commerce, it's software, and right now we're moving into AI, right, and then the other thing that we haven't seen happen in the e-commerce world yet, from a physical goods perspective, is any kind of adoption of, say, crypto and blockchain, which I actually think from a lending perspective could be very, very interesting, right? But you have to get that all the way into the payment processing, right? So that you can really start dialing that in. And I think those tools would be great tools to reduce the cost of financing the e-commerce, right? If you actually had a blockchain that said, hey, this transaction is 20% owned by OnRamp because of the financing we gave, and the wallet then is just automatically updated, right? And some of that can happen today, right? It's using existing banking tools, right? But that becomes very cumbersome. Whereas I think the blockchain technology is going to be really interesting in that regard, because it will just shorten duration cycles. It reduces risk. That will bring the cost of capital down, from a credit facility perspective, to a group like OnRamp. But then that means that we can pass that reduction in cost onto that merchant, right? So that everybody can just run more efficiently. So I think when I think about it from my world, right, that's where I think that's an interesting play. The challenge is, the blockchain payment processing, Visa can run, what is it, 50,000, 80,000 transactions. I think it's a second.
Yeah.
And blockchain takes 6 seconds to run a transaction, right? You just, that friction stops sales. So, there's a lot of infrastructure that has to be built and improvements have to be built in that to make that happen. So I think that's one interesting area, that sits in our world, right? But there are, there are opportunities in the marketing stack, in the sales stack, in the fulfillment stack, right? Like what Amazon has built with FBA is phenomenal, right? And it takes scale to do that. I still think there's a massive opportunity for a third party to come in and try to do something like that to aggregate merchants. Shopify tried, but that's a capital intensive business, and Shopify tries not to get in the capital intensive space. And I think that makes sense, right? They're a software first company. Running warehouses is not a software business, right? It's a location and employee business and that sort of thing. But, heck, as you see Optimus robots from Tesla coming online, at what point are you actually going to start running warehouses 24/7, because you actually don't need people, right? And you're not asking somebody to work the graveyard shift. You need those employees that know how to repair a robot and, fix the system, but that the robotic workers are actually doing the work, right? That's going to be another interesting one. And again, those things will further drive down costs, which then is a benefit both to the business and the consumer.
And those drones can fly 24/7.
Yeah.
Yeah, crypto is definitely an interesting space, and I'm very curious to see what happens with payments, especially if this Genius Act gets passed, because essentially merchants right now are paying between 2.5 to 3% per transaction unless they're putting it onto the consumer. That's a lot
Right.
of money when it's rounded up, right? We have two people that control that market. It's Visa and MasterCard.
Yep.
Okay. Now, I don't think Visa just sits back. They had to be preparing for this moment, right? But what happens? Do we not use PayPal and we just exchange through a stablecoin, right? To pass
Could
that
be.
through?
I mean,
Or is there another integration that we use where we're just going to be a lower fee?
or is it just that Visa goes in and drives that adoption, and you keep using your Visa card, but now
It's a
that's
blockchain.
it's tied into that blockchain, where then that we could go in as the consumer is doing the transaction with the merchant, right? When that merchant has proven that the product has got a shipping label, right? So it's been shipped. Hey, now those funds are going to the merchant. If that merchant has borrowed funds, then, hey, you've connected us to your wallet. You've agreed that, here's the remittance rate on a per transaction basis. Boom, that's coming, and then that split's happening there at the, at the point of sale,
Mm-hmm.
right? Again, that reduces OnRamp's risk. That means we're going to reduce our fees, and That means the merchant's going to have a lower cost of capital, which makes capital more capital more accessible. Which for e-commerce businesses, these guys are not venture fundable, right? They don't have investment pockets.
Does Visa launch their own stablecoin at that point rather than using a Tether or a USDC?
I don't know. And honestly, what's the cost of using Tether? Why create your own, right? Or what USDC, right? I know that Starlink's using one of those two, right? But they're using it for they're essentially exchanging, global currencies, right, at the point of sale into that, so that they can just further reduce exchange rate risk, right?
I'm going to Portugal tomorrow. Just so everybody knows now.
I'm jealous.
Yeah.
I want to go.
My wife wanted to buy some euros. So she goes to Chase, she buys euros, 12%. We got charged 12%. That's insane.
Yep. And that shouldn't be happening, right? But if you took your Bitcoin, now
if I took
you
my
don't
Bitcoin,
want to
I could do whatever I want, right?
Right. Yeah, but if you wanted to go, then say, hey, great, I'm going to go put cash into a Tether, and then I'm going to go convert that Tether into Portuguese dollars. You're not going to pay that 12% fee. There's still a fee, right? It's probably not going to be 12%.
I just thought that was really high, right?
Yeah.
So, fortunately, we only do business in one currency. Me and Luigi, we don't work overseas, but I could see how that could be a nightmare really quick.
Yeah, the
currency risk.
Yeah, and if you're building Starlink, right?
Yeah.
By default, you're going to be dealing with every country in the world, which means you've got 190 currencies to go address.
Absolutely. Well, Eric, thank you so much for being here. We want to be respectful of your time. Can you tell everybody where they can find you and they can find out more about OnRamp?
Yeah. We're available at onrampfunds.com, OnRampFunds.com. There's the website right there. Thank you for sharing it. We've got a full sales team here that's happy to answer any questions. Make sure that, any of your needs are met. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all the other social channels as well. And we're just here to help e-commerce merchants grow their business.
Eric, thank you. Everybody, that's a wrap at the Liquid Lunch Project. We'll catch you on the next episode.
Let's go!